The Cincinnati Bengals certainly drafted for upside. I'm joined today by Mike Renner to discuss the Cincinnati Bengals 2025 draft haul.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Jake Liscow, and as Locked On Bengals goes, we've been covering the Cincinnati Bengals since 2016, joined today by Mike Renner, CBS Sports analyst, who's been doing awesome draft work between his time at PFF and now with CBS Sports for years. We've been having Mike on the show to talk about what his thoughts are before the draft, after the draft, and today will be an after the draft episode. If you're an everydayer, welcome back to Locked On Bengals. Appreciate you coming back. If you're not an everydayer yet, you can hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss an episode. And also want to thank all of you out there who make Locked On Bengals your first listen. And Mike, I went through your top 150 again before we started recording, and the Bengals got some guys in there. I think four of the players the Bengals drafted, maybe four of the players the Bengals drafted in your top 150. And I asked you before we started recording, would you agree if I described this Bengals draft as a draft for upside? And you said yeah, but when you think about that answer, how many of the players the Bengals picked do you see as upside picks? Like, if you go through each one, how many of them are swings for the fences?
Probably four, I would say. I think Stewart pick, Demetrius Knight pick, Barrett Carter pick, and Jalen Rivers pick. I think all of those are upside plays. Fairchild feels like not as much, felt more of like a scramble at the time where it's like, hey, we need someone who could probably play for us this year. And he was probably the best on the board for them in that regard. But it felt like an upside draft, but also a draft where it's like they really identified holes and said, we have to go there, unfortunately. And I feel like that's just not how you get surplus value in the draft. Ultimately, it's how you end up getting reaches more often than not, and maybe, getting guys earlier than where you would like them. So it just felt like they're like, we have to get a linebacker, we have to get a guard, and we have to get a pass rusher in the first three rounds. And then by the third, they're like, okay, well, we're stuck with, Dylan Fairchild, who's top of my board.
Dylan Fairchild is a guy that I think the Bengals see as a player with upside. What when you think about Fairchild, do you think makes him more of like an immediate play versus an upside play that stands him out from the other guys?
Well, I just don't think he's like a physically dominant guard, right? I don't think he is this impressive specimen at the guard position, even in the way that like maybe his teammate Tate Ralitch is. I think he's just like a fine athlete. And I think watching him on tape, he, going against the level of competition he went against, I just feel like he's a little more NFL ready, although he hasn't played a ton, a year and a half, I think, about in terms of snaps as a starter. So he does need more reps, but it just isn't quite the high-end athlete that those other guys are.
Gotcha. Obviously, going to start with Shamar Stewart here, even though we've talked about some of the other guys. But in terms of an upside swing, Shamar Stewart, described by NFL GMs and the athletic or executives in the athletics post-draft gathering feedback from executives article as an upside pick. Obviously, there's upside when you consider his college production versus his traits. And in that regard, there's productivity upside, especially when it comes to finishing plays, sacks, tackles for loss, where he's a very disruptive player, or at least a disruptive player, if not very disruptive player. But the finishing isn't a big part of his game right now. There's another side of this coin to me, Mike, which is when you have that level of athletic tools and that size, and by all accounts, football character, good character, he's going to go in there and work hard. That offers you a bit of a floor in the way that Amarius Mims' size and athletic traits offered him a floor. He was more technically refined, I think, as a player coming out, despite the inexperience, than Shamar Stewart. But how do you balance those things when you think about upside versus floor for a guy with the traits that Shamar Stewart has?
I feel like we were just saying this a couple of years ago, though, about Myles Murphy, and obviously his floor has been pretty low, right? And you look at his athletic traits, and it's not as if we haven't seen a Shamar Stewart ever, right? In terms of the athlete. And obviously, Myles Murphy ran a faster 40 than he did at a heavier weight and has explosive traits that are in the ballpark of what Shamar Stewart has. Now, I do think on tape, Shamar Stewart is the twitcher athlete, but I thought Myles Murphy, like earlier in his career, Clemson had some better tape and put better tape out than Shamar Stewart really ever did at Texas A&M. So I'm not necessarily certain it gives you a high floor, especially when he does miss as many opportunities as he does. And it's like infuriating watching his tape. And it's going to be frustrating for Bengals fans because I haven't seen a lot of guys in that mold who are just struggle as much as he does to finish at the ball carrier, whether it's like any position, right? I think tackling in and of itself is a skill. Yeah, it can be coached up. But if a linebacker can't tackle at the collegiate level, he's not all of a sudden going to be Bobby Wagner in the NFL, right? It's not something that just turns around wholesale. He can get better at it, but I think it's always going to be an issue for a guy like that. But the reason I worry about him, and like when I did a bunch of exercise in terms of pre-draft mocks and like what we would do, what I would do sort of mocks, and with other people, just like everyone continuously didn't really want to take that chance on Shamar Stewart, just because you could be ending up with that guy who 3 years down the line, you're still trying to talk yourself into, and just he really hasn't taken that next step in his development. Now, it doesn't take a lot when you are that physically gifted to, I was a Pacs fan. I'm a Pacs fan. Rashawn Gary obviously was in a similar mold, and 2 years of frustrating play. And then all of a sudden, year 3, he looked like a changed man. And obviously that pick turns out to be a good one in retrospect. And it doesn't take that many moves. Like Rashawn Gary really just learned to bull rush and kind of a counter off of it. And that's who he is now. And that's really all he does. And he can be effective because he is so gifted athletically. But it just might take you a while to get to that level of consistency. And even Rashawn Gary now, even kind of, having lost a step after the ACL, is really neutered in terms of his effectiveness. Really was not the same player last year.
There's also Lucas Van Ness on the other side of that for the Packers. I just talked to Justice Mosqueda, actually. Two Green Bay perspectives here on Shamar Stewart. And that episode will be out tomorrow for those of you who are watching this before that episode is released. And talked about exactly like you said, the plan for Shamar Stewart is give him a pass rush move. Get him one move that he can do at a high level and get him a counter off it. And that's exactly what you're talking about with Rashawn Gary. But with Shamar, you're saying, I hear you saying that you like Myles Murphy on tape better. The big difference between those guys athletically is the jumps. And Shamar didn't do agility. Talking to Justice, he thinks that when Shamar Stewart had the opportunity to pin his ears back and try to turn the corner, he thought he saw a high quality bend on tape for Shamar Stewart. But what about the run defense? So a lot of people will point to the PFF run defense grade and that trending in the right direction. The ability to, when he does try to play with technique in the run game, use his length in the run game to lock out a block, shed a block. When he has his eyes on the ball, where do you think he is as a run defender right now?
I think he's okay. I do think he really struggles to find the football and to kind of recognize and react. If it's just base block, tackles attacking him, and he knows I can just go into his chest, right, long arm, whatever, I think he's fine. I think his technique's solid there, and I think like he can be an edge setter. I just don't see a guy who's who right now is going to do much more than just hold the point of attack. Asking him to shed finish plays, I didn't see that consistently on his tape. And that obviously shows in any of the numbers you want to go into about him. So obviously, like the athlete, the strength, the explosiveness, it's all there to be a high-end edge setter and a high-end run defender. But just technically right now, it really is just he can hold on to a block. That's about all I felt good about seeing on tape from him.
I have one more question about Shamar Stewart. I do want maybe two. I have two more questions on Shamar Stewart. It turns out we'll finish up on Shamar Stewart, then get to the rest of the draft class coming up next. This episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by Upwork, and Upwork knows that scaling your business requires the right expertise at the right time. And with Upwork, you can find those specialized freelancers in marketing, development, design, and more fields, experts ready to help take your business to the next level. Upwork gives you that flexibility you need by connecting you with top freelance talent across multiple industries, including IT, AI, web development, and marketing. Whether you need extra hands for a project or a long-term partner, Upwork makes hiring simple and affordable. It's cost-effective growth. You don't even have to hire full-time. They'll help you find affordable top-tier freelancers to scale your business effectively. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's Upwork, Upwork.com, Upwork.com to connect with top talent and grow your business today. Mike, my two remaining questions about Shamar Stewart revolve around your idea of if you were in charge of his development plan, what would that look like? And then a comparative discussion around Myles Murphy as a prospect versus Shamar Stewart as a prospect that you've alluded to a little bit here, but I want to dig into a little bit more. But I asked Justice the same question. So we'll get this answer from Justice in the next episode for the everydayers, but I want to get your take as well. If you're looking at Shamar Stewart, being experienced as you are as a draft analyst and a guy who's followed the Packers, what would you say is priority 1 and priority 2 for his development?
I mean, I think it's just the long arm bull rush is priority 1. Getting that to a point where you just feel confident in it. I think getting him, gosh, I almost want to put him on a basketball court too and just get him, because he is a little more laterally twitched up than like he can really cross face on an offensive tackle when he wants to. So like getting that into his game as well and more refined, because I just don't see like a crossover move in basketball. There's like a salesmanship to it. There's a body control that like your body goes one way before it goes the other to sell, to beat an offensive lineman. When he would do inside moves in college, when he would do things of that nature, there really was none of that, right? There was no setting the offensive tackle up. It was just super linear. Same thing you worry about or talk about when it's like tight ends route running and things of that nature, where they just straight line to straight line. You need a little bit more salesmanship when you're trying to get past an offensive tackle. So those two things are priorities 1A, 1B for me in Shamar Stewart when watching his tape.
He does have one clip that I know I've seen on Twitter where he actually has that bit of a Euro step kind of thing. And so what I'm hearing is just put him over the center and have him watch a bunch of Myles Garrett and Micah Parsons and learn that crossover move, right?
Euro step. Yes. Just have him watch Manu Ginobili circa 2006 on repeat.
There you go. The next topic here before we turn the page on Shamar Stewart and get into the rest of the class here as a conversation is you made the comparison for the Bengals of they drafted another really athletic player in Myles Murphy. Obviously, there are differences to their game. But when you consider what you saw from those guys on tape, and you consider what you expect them to be in the NFL, what do you think the primary differences are? And having seen Myles Murphy's development so far, I guess, do you still think that there is a chance for him to find his footing in the NFL?
Man, he just had such a bad year this past year. And I don't know what it was. But again, he is a guy who was very young, still young coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And that, he's younger than a lot of guys who are like top 2 rounders. He's 2 years younger than Demetrius Knight, right? So he has room to grow, and I'm not going to write off any guy who's that freakish. And like, he was good as a true freshman at Clemson. So like there is innate talent there, but it's just, he's got to get more under control, man. I just watch him and it looks like a chicken with his head cut off. There just needs to be a plan, snap in and snap out from Myles Murphy. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I just have not seen that from him throughout his career this far.
I think the hope there is that a new coaching staff that is explicitly been hired, that has explicitly been hired to try to develop young players in a way that Lou Anarumo's staff was unable to do. So that's a hope there. And then last thing, what's the big difference to you between Shamar Stewart and Myles Murphy, or what are like the couple things that come to mind at the top of the list?
I do think, like I said, Murphy a little more linear than Stewart. Stewart does have a little more lateral agility to his game. I did think Murphy was stronger though, coming out of Clemson, like a little bit more like when he's engaged on a block, you saw physicality with his upper body and ability to shed. Now, obviously that has to translate to the NFL, But I do think like that's still, he is a little bit more of a strength power sort of player, whereas Stewart's more just an athlete in terms of how he wins at this point.
Interesting stuff. Let's shift gears and talk about that player that is a little bit older than Myles Murphy. The Bengals go linebacker Demetrius Knight in the second round, who again is in your top 150, but is your linebacker 5, I want to say, behind Nick Martin, who I thought was maybe 6, who was Nick Martin, I thought was a very early pick in the third round. You think that was a more appropriate time than I did for him to be picked, judging from your top 150 here. And behind guys like Chris Paul, Danny Stutzman, who go a little bit later. What were your thoughts when the Bengals were on the clock in the second round? Demetrius Knight ends up being the pick, both about the pick and what you thought could have been an alternative plan.
Yeah, I just thought it was a misappropriation of value, unfortunately. Like, I think Demetrius Knight's a fine linebacker. It just was not the position where you necessarily needed to take a linebacker. In this class, it felt like Jihad Campbell, Carson Schlesinger were the two guys where it's like, yeah, you see starters in those two. And then after that, there really wasn't a guy who I would have taken until Nick Martin came off the board at 75. I think that was actually the next linebacker on my board was 75th overall. And so it was just not a good linebacker class. And it felt like them saying, we're going to cut Tremaine Pratt. We need an off-ball linebacker. We have to get it. Let's get it here at 49 when, Demetrius Knight's I'm not putting it past him. He is a dog on tape. Like, he plays super physical. He's a hitter. He's a good straight line athlete. He's a good tackler out in space. I do worry about him in coverage a little bit. Even though like he has athletic tools to go sideline to sideline range wise, I just think he's a little stiff turning his hips, matching and mirroring. I don't think he's at his best, but he does have like a great frame for the position. He's obviously hasn't played a ton of football at linebacker, so maybe there's some development there. I'm not saying he's going to be a bad player. I'm just saying, man, that was 49 overall. Like, that's a top 50 pick in the NFL draft. There are guys that came off the board that could be like Nick Scort, a couple picks later, could be a high-end edge rusher someday. You had Benjamin Morrison, who was like a first-round talent at corner that fell to that point in the draft because of injury. But like, there are players in the top 50 that are, it's still a premium pick. And Demetrius Knight's best case scenario feels like, $15 million a year type of player, right? And that's just, in my opinion, misappropriating value at that point in the draft.
I want to ask one follow-up question about the coverage stuff, because I agree. We've talked about the misappropriation of value. I've talked about it as an opportunity cost of I don't have major issues with the player. I think that he will be a starter for the Bengals. I think he'll play a lot of snaps. I think he'll be a solid player. And you talked about the skill set. It's just what are you passing on in order to make that pick? And when we've talked a lot about Tate Ratledge, but you talked about some other guys there as well, between Nick Skirton and Benjamin Morrison, who obviously has a lot of familiarity with Al Golden being a Notre Dame guy. There's also Trey Amos. I would throw into the list of guys, and Andrew Makuba if the Bengals were interested in the secondary, which I think they were interested in. Safety, Kevin Winston was a guy that we've talked about on Locked On Bengals as a guy that they may have been considering at this point. But as far as coverage concerns, is that more of a man thing with Demetrius Knight? Because it seems like in zone, to me, just watching a little bit on tape, it seems like his zone instincts are pretty good. He seems like he has a pretty good understanding for the most part of what teams are trying to do from a passing concept perspective, and being in the right place to try to take some of those windows away.
Yeah, it's more just fluidity in space, so whether that's turning and running and say like the runner in cover 2, or whether that's matching up on a tight end and man coverage, it's more just like having him change directions, those sort of things. I'm not saying he's like lost. I do think he is good in zone coverage. I mean, the guy was a former quarterback, right? He came into college thinking he was going to play quarterback. So I think he understands offense and how it works and isn't out of place and doesn't lack instinctual football plays. But it is more just, I think he's a little tight-hipped for an athlete to be, to just reach like the pinnacle of the position at linebacker. Right? So I think you're going to give up some limitations for other strengths in this game.
We did see the Bengals double dip at linebacker. So I have a little bit more on the linebacker topic. Want to talk about Jalen Rivers and Taj Brooks as well. We'll talk about those guys. And honestly, I have a philosophical question to get to here, Mike. And we'll close the show on those topics here coming up next. So the Bengals drafted 2 linebackers. Obviously, they come back and draft Barrett Carter on day 3, and that's a guy that they had graded at least around, if not more, higher than where they were able to select him in the 4th round. It was a surprising double dip to me, to be honest. I was certain they would draft at least one linebacker, and I knew that they probably wanted to. But what was interesting to me about it the most was maybe Al Golden discussing the roles for these guys as entirely different types of players, seeing Barrett Carter as a true like stack potential future Mike linebacker, where he described Demetrius Knight as more of a traditional outside linebacker. Like he could be an outside linebacker, sure, in a 4-3, and he will do that for the Bengals. That sounds like that's going to be their base, but also in a 3-4, he feels like Demetrius Knight could line up and be a bit of a pass rusher in that role. So when you think about these guys and the different roles they play, does that resonate with what you thought when you were watching these guys on tape at all? If you were envisioning roles for them in the NFL?
Yeah, I do think Knight can be more of like a strong side or a 3-4 outside linebacker if that's like what you're playing now. More trend more towards off ball, obviously, but I think he's a much better blitzer than Barrett Carter. Carter, I saw as more of a weak side linebacker, truthfully. Now, if you want to play him at Mike linebacker, I think you can in a pinch. I do worry about his ability to stack and shed. I think that was the biggest reason why going after his sophomore year at Clemson, 2022, I was like, man, this guy's such a good athlete. He's so fluid. And I think truthfully, like their dime linebacker, third down linebacker, he's the best one. He is your best coverage linebacker right now on this Bengals roster. He really is fluid. He can move. He can run. He looks like a safety out there at the linebacker position. But when you ask him to go down and take on blocks and really do the dirty work, that's where I saw him struggle. I think he got bowled over more than I'd like as a tackler in terms of just like giving up ground on contact. And so it really is the play strength and physicality with him that's the biggest issue. That's why I trend more towards weak side linebacker with him rather than Mike linebacker. But I don't think he's, completely unwilling to play blocks between the tackles. I just don't think he's particularly good at it.
It sounds like the early envisaged role for Carter is, it sounds like the Bengals are going to want to match 12 personnel with base this year. Sounds like they're going to want to put 3 linebackers on the field. A lot of time, and they've done this in the past, but a lot of times they would match out with 5 defensive linemen. A lot of times they would match out with keeping Mike Hilton on the field in the past when Mike Hilton was on the team. He won't be back this year, obviously. In that world, to me, the idea of Barrett Carter being I'm going to deal with the athletic tight end of that 12 personnel package makes sense to me. And that's what Al Golden has described when you're describing the strengths and weaknesses as you see them in terms of the roles for these guys. Because also interestingly to me, he sees it as Demetrius Knight, at least right now. We'll see what happens after he gets his hands on these guys and sees them in practice. Demetrius Knight and Logan Wilson are going to be your nickel backers. And the backup to Logan Wilson will be Barrett Carter, was what Al Golden described. What are your thoughts around that approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes the most sense. Like I said, Barrett Carter is your best cover backer at this point in time. But if you're playing nickel, you still have to have 2 guys on the field that can really play the run. Right. I do think that's why I say he's more of a dime linebacker when it's like you're really not worried about the run, right? When it's like a 3rd and long, 4th and long, that's when you probably come back on the football field. So yeah, that to me makes the most sense.
You were describing Jalen Rivers as one of the upside picks here. Is it just an injury question for you and the missed games throughout his time at the collegiate level, or what about Jalen Rivers stands out to you as an upside guy? I think the Bengals really like the position versatility, the fact that he's played a lot of tackle and guard.
I think he fits in far more than Dylan Fairchild does, just physically along that offensive line, right? I mean, it is a mammoth tackle duo that you have there. I think with those 2 guys, you can do a lot of, impressive stuff in gap schemes. And Jalen Rivers is a gap scheme tackle / guard, right? Like I remember walking past me I was out down here at Miami's pro day, and he walks past me. I'm like, oof, that's just like, that is what it looks like when that sort of player just built differently, so to speak. Like a guy who's just long arms and not like carrying much fat to be 325. So an impressive specimen. I do think that the injuries are a concern. I don't think his tape is necessarily anything impressive in the running game as much as it should have been at his size with his physicality or with like his physical tools. So those two things come to mind, but I think he's firmly a guard at the next level who in a pinch you can throw out at tackle.
I think that's the idea. I've heard several people describe his pass blocking tape as boring because it just looks a little bit too easy for him at times. Obviously, the Bengals are prioritizing pass protection. Dylan Fairchild's PFF pass protection data very strong as well. The pass protection data doesn't always translate, and sometimes there's technical work to be done, and the collegiate game is what it is when it comes to asking guys to hold up in pass protection the way the Bengals are going to ask guys to hold up in true pass sets. But how do you see Jalen Rivers as a hitting the ground running kind of player? Is that in the cards for him as a pass blocker?
100%. I think so I did not, and why I actually, the Bengals day 3, I did not have Barrett Carter having much lower a grade than Demetrius Knight. I didn't have Jalen Rivers having much lower of a grade than Dylan Fairchild. So like there's a very, I don't want to say good shot, but there is a real shot that Rivers starts over Fairchild early on. He's played a lot more football. And obviously, a lot of the best guards in the NFL were not guards in college. It's just easier to go from tackle to like, I'd rather take a tackle and put him at guard. I think that guy's more NFL ready than a guy who played guard in college, because more often than not, your NFL defensive tackles, not more often than not, but a lot of NFL defensive tackles that you're asked to block, well, they move like the edge rushers in college. They move like the guys you have to block out in space. So you just get more attuned. You just, the play speed and what you have to be is more like the NFL at tackle at the collegiate level than it is at guard, even if it's in the SEC like Fairchild was.
Going to be interesting to see how those guys battled out. They might both end up starting with the Bengals depth chart on the interior offensive line. And we did talk to Mike Potts last week. And if you missed that episode, you can go check that out for the non-everydayers out there and get his thoughts on Jalen Rivers' ability to play both sides. But last pick here before we get to this quick philosophical conversation that I want to have, Taj Brooks, 5'9", 214, a very densely built linebacker, a bell cow at Texas Tech, who was extremely productive. And despite that 214 weight, a 4.52, so he has some athleticism to him, a decent athletic tester for a very densely built running back. Do you have any significant thoughts around Taj Brooks as a potential complement, a bit of a short yardage guy to go with Chase Brown?
I was very surprised by that 4.52 because he does not run that. Like on tape, he's not that, but he was also listed at 230 on tape. But he's been a guy who's really reliable runner, strong lower half, breaks a ton of tackles, just not explosive though. So that's why I'm interested. Like 4.52, if he really is going to trim down and be in better shape, there's some untapped potential there. I think there's a very good shot he makes the roster. He's going to make the roster. I think there's a very good shot he gets some real touches because I don't think he's a slouch by any means. Like he's a 4th round back in a normal running back class. Like a lot of times, more often than not, he's a 4th rounder than a 6th rounder, right? A talent like he is. So I do think, maybe he's not like a super high upside guy, but I think he can run the NFL for sure.
I think it's interesting that you're largely on the same page as we were for the value for the Bengals in this draft. And I like their day 3. I thought the day 3 was a solid day 3. And they've done this a couple of times lately where previously the criticism was, man, you're setting some of those late round picks on fire. Haven't felt that way this year. I don't really feel like they set any pick on fire, which kind of goes into our philosophical topic here, where it seems like teams are getting a little bit better for the most part. There's still some outliers at drafting to consensus about not going totally off the reservation, off the map, and doing things that are totally unanticipated. And Eric DaCosta, the Ravens GM, went viral for a clip this week talking about teams are all essentially the same in terms of success rate. And so as a result, regardless of where you pick, your first round pick your first overall pick might not hit sometimes. And the 20th pick, the difference in hit rate there isn't necessarily as big as you might think. And so for DaCosta, the idea is, well, we should just be adding picks. So this brings me to this question of, what do you think about the Bengals fit in this world where NFL teams are homogenizing the way they draft and the way that they approach a draft and their hit rates and those sorts of questions?
I think a lot of it's analytics driven, where most analytics departments are identifying the same red flag guys in rounds one, right? Like red flag production guys. Maybe your scouts come back and they say they have the athletic traits, but the analytics says, they're more second rounders because XYZ. So I think you're getting analytics departments are being more informed, but then also, not to like toot my horn as PFF, but like PFF Ultimate and the proliferation and ease of use of basically watching tape now. I talked to Rick Spielman when he worked at CBS when I first got there, and he said he got through twice as many players when they got PFF Ultimate. So your just ability to watch more of some of these top guys and even guys down the board, I think just gives you better info and better insight into who they are. So I think it's kind of a combination of those things, is that you're able to watch a lot more tape on these guys. You're able to get a lot more information background on them, and you're able to have your analytics departments basically warn you about, who has bigger bust potential than others. I think you are seeing a little convergence in the scouting community in terms of like final evals. That's not to say it's not everyone, but I do think you are eliminating your who is it? Terrell Edmondses of the world, your Cleveland Ferrell's top five. And some of those are just GMs that are also out of the league, right? When we don't have a Dave Gettleman in the NFL anymore, when you don't have a John Gruden in the NFL, when you don't have Bill Belichick, guys who are kind of siloed in the information they consume, and people who are more willing to get the scouting process and the evaluation process be a collaborative effort between all aspects of the organization, then you're going to kind of come to more of a consensus than ever before.
Catching up to the process that we've been doing in our spreadsheet, where we've been trying to incorporate data as a risk weight, essentially, that is like, hey, maybe you really like this player on tape, but here's a reason that maybe you should pump the brakes on the first round. I also find the PFF Ultimate thing, just one more note there, just in case people don't know what it is and you're just rolling your eyes at PFF, it's just a tool for these NFL teams that allows them to say, I want to watch all of the wide nine snaps for pass rusher X. And then they can very easily see a cut up of, okay, here's all the snaps at this alignment. Here's all the snaps at this alignment. Here's all the snaps in this coverage scheme or against this route concept. It's a way for NFL teams to get a very targeted look at players. And if you're just watching tape, you're just going through a game chronologically, you have to really pick those things apart. Or you need someone to go through and be a video analyst to put together these, okay, here's all my clips of, Barrett Carter running the pole in Tampa 2. And somebody has to go do that work manually, where this PFF Ultimate tool gives you the opportunity to automate a lot of that. And that's why a guy like Rick Spielman will say, I can get through so much more with that kind of tool.
Yes. And when you only watch, it used to be you watched games, right? And if you pulled out 4 games of a guy, and even if it was his 4 best games competition, it's like, well, maybe he is hampering an ankle injury that half of the season. Then you missed like the 4 other games that he was healthy and was balling out, or if you just, for some reason didn't see him at his best, or missed things, you missed a lot. But now in PFF, you can basically go back and be like, oh, I'll watch all the times where he, positively and negatively graded, where it's like they were actually impacting a play one way or another. It just helps you drill down and watch more on a guy, cover more games, cover more time of him playing without watching all the snaps that don't actually do anything, that aren't actually him doing a thing that matters to the next level.
Yeah, a helpful tool for sure. Last question, Mike, is what are the Bengals doing weird compared to the rest of the NFL? Because we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, and you kind of were in agreement. The Bengals are a little bit weird compared to the rest of the NFL that's homogenizing.
Yeah, they're not. They more just feel stuck in decision-making that was kind of the norm 10 to 15 years ago. I think they probably don't have a massive analytics staff in their ears about these guys. They probably don't have, and obviously don't have a massive scouting staff. So again, we're reaching less consensus when you have fewer voices in the room, when it's just 2 or 3 opinions making this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if one of them's way off the wall, all of a sudden, that's what you get a Demetrius Knight that we talked about, where, even the biggest fans I saw of Demetrius Knight in the draft analysis space, I think Trevor at PFF was the highest I saw anyone. And I'm not sure, I don't even know if he ended up with him in the top 50. So like, it just felt like a position and sort of just a team treating the draft how it used to be, where it's like, we have a need, go fill that need, and not listening to an analytics department say like, hey, from a team building strategy, this is probably earlier than you'd like to go for a linebacker with his sort of grade, because it's not going to, save us any cap room, and we need to save cap room. So we should prioritize positions where, you can find at this point in the draft that will save us money down the line that we don't have to pay $20-30 million to fill out our roster if we want to go find that guy in free agency. So I think that's where I see the Bengals right now, is they're just not necessarily keeping up with the Joneses in terms of how they treat the draft.
Classic Bengals. You can find Mike's work on Twitter at Mike Renner _. You can find him on CBS Sports, where he does some great work both in writing and video for Mike. Always appreciate the time. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Our next episode is focused deeply on Shamar Stewart with Justice Mosqueda and Chris Sims. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.